Samantha Keithley was the devoted mother and beloved neighbor everyone admired. But behind her bright smile was a secret plan to escape her controlling marriage. Mark Keithley, a respected sheriff's deputy, was sworn to protect his community, yet inside his own home, he became the greatest danger of all. When Samantha's lifeless body was found in their bedroom with Mark's service weapon beside her, the story of a tragic accident quickly unraveled into a tale of betrayal, lies, and cold-blooded murder. This is not just the story of a marriage gone wrong. It is the chilling case of why a deputy chose to murder his wife. Samantha Keithley was the kind of woman everyone admired. She was active in her children's school, volunteered at local charity events, and always had a warm smile for anyone who crossed her path. Her social media was filled with pictures of family vacations, birthday parties, and cozy nights at home. To outsiders, she was living the dream life: a loving husband, 2 healthy kids, and a beautiful home in a quiet Florida neighborhood. But pictures can lie, and behind the filters and smiles, Samantha was hiding a storm. Mark Keithley, her husband, was a respected sheriff's deputy with over 10 years of service. People saw him as dependable and dedicated, the kind of man who would run toward danger to protect others. To their friends, Mark and Samantha were the ideal couple. They had met young, fallen in love quickly, and built a life together that many envied. No one could imagine the darkness lurking behind their closed doors. In recent months, Samantha had begun to feel suffocated in her marriage. Friends noticed subtle changes. She seemed quieter, less cheerful, and hesitant when talking about Mark. Privately, she confided in one close friend that she was unhappy and considering leaving. The thought terrified her. Mark was not the type of man who would let go easily. He valued control and hated losing, and a divorce could ruin his image as the perfect lawman and family man. Despite her fears, Samantha started making quiet plans. She researched apartments and even looked into divorce attorneys online. She wanted a fresh start for herself and her children, far from the tension that had taken over her home. What Samantha didn't know was that someone else had plans too. Plans that would make sure she never walked away alive. October 14th started like any other day in the Keithley household. The Florida sun dipped below the horizon as Samantha prepared dinner for the family. The kids laughed in the living room while Mark sat at the kitchen table scrolling through his phone, his badge and gun resting on the counter. To anyone looking in, it seemed like an ordinary evening. But inside Samantha's mind, the weight of her decision was pressing harder than ever. She had finally decided to leave him. What she didn't know was that Mark had sensed it, and he wasn't about to let that happen. Dinner was quiet. Mark hardly spoke, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on Samantha in a way that made her uneasy. After the dishes were cleared, the kids went upstairs, their laughter fading into the background as they settled in for the night. Samantha retreated to the bedroom, scrolling through her phone and texting a friend about her plans to leave. She felt nervous but hopeful, unaware that every move she made was being watched. Around 10:45 p.m., a sound shattered the stillness of the neighborhood, a single gunshot that echoed down the quiet street. A neighbor sitting on her porch froze, listening as a woman's scream followed the blast. Within minutes, 911 calls poured in. Deputies raced to the Keithley home, lights flashing and sirens cutting through the dark. When they arrived, the scene was chilling. Samantha lay motionless on the bed, her body soaked in blood, a bullet wound piercing her chest. The room smelled of gunpowder, the sheets stained red. Mark was on the floor, his hands shaking, tears streaming down his face. Beside him was his service weapon. He muttered that it was an accident, that Samantha grabbed the gun during an argument and it went off. But as officers scanned the room, doubts began to form. Something about this didn't feel like an accident at all. From the very beginning, detectives were unsettled by what they saw inside the Keithley home. Mark's story was that Samantha had grabbed his service weapon during a heated argument, and in the struggle, the gun accidentally discharged. Yet the evidence in front of them told a very different story. Samantha's wound showed no signs of being a close-range shot. If the gun had gone off while they wrestled for control, there would have been powder burns or stippling on her skin. Instead, the entry wound was clean, suggesting the shot came from a distance. Her body's position also raised doubts. She was found neatly lying across the bed, her arms at her sides, as if she had been sitting or reclining when the bullet struck her. In a chaotic struggle, her body would not have landed so still or in such an orderly posture. Investigators scanned the room for signs of a fight. Overturned furniture, scattered belongings, broken objects, but everything was in place. There was no trace of the violent confrontation Mark described. The most telling evidence came from the forensic tests. Residue swabs showed heavy gunpowder particles on Mark's hands, but Samantha's came back clean. If she had handled the gun, there should have been traces on her fingers or palms. That absence was impossible to ignore. The only logical conclusion was that Mark had fired the weapon, not Samantha. Detectives also took note of Mark himself. His clothing had no tears, scratches, or marks that would suggest a physical struggle. His hands were uninjured, his face unmarked. A fight that intense would almost certainly have left at least minor bruising or abrasions. Instead, Mark looked unharmed, except for the tears he shed as he repeated his claim of an accident. For the investigators, the first red flags had already started to wave. As detectives dug deeper into Samantha's life, a different picture of her marriage began to surface. The woman once thought to be living a dream was quietly planning her escape. Her phone and laptop revealed a trail of searches for divorce lawyers and apartment rentals, as if she had been weighing her options carefully. She was not acting impulsively. She was preparing for a new chapter, one without Mark. This discovery alone hinted at a possible motive, but the story grew darker the further investigators looked. Friends and relatives described Samantha as increasingly withdrawn in recent months. She no longer seemed eager to host family gatherings or attend neighborhood events. In private conversations, she confessed she felt trapped in her marriage. One friend remembered her saying that Mark's controlling nature was suffocating her. He wanted to know where she was at all times, questioned her about who she spoke to, and grew paranoid if she came home late from errands. What once may have seemed like protective concern had transformed into obsession. Financial records added another layer of concern. The couple was struggling under mounting debt, a burden Samantha never openly shared. Despite his steady job as a deputy, Mark had taken out loans and maxed out credit cards. When investigators looked at their insurance policies, they found something chilling. 2 life insurance plans in Samantha's name, both of which listed Mark as the sole beneficiary. If Samantha left him, not only would he lose control, but he would also face financial ruin. If she died, however, he would gain a payout that could erase their debts entirely. What had started as whispers of marital problems now looked like a powder keg of control, money, and desperation. For investigators, the question became clearer. Was this the true motive behind Samantha's death? Mark Keithley sat through endless rounds of questioning, repeating the same story again and again. It had been an accident. According to him, Samantha grabbed his gun in a moment of anger, and as they fought over it, the weapon went off. But each time detectives asked for details, his account shifted. At first, he claimed the gun had been on his belt, and Samantha reached for it in rage. Later, he said he had left it on the dresser, and she picked it up in an attempt to scare him. The inconsistencies piled up quickly, and with each version, the credibility of his story crumbled. Detectives also noticed how Mark tried to insert small details that could not be verified. In one interview, he insisted the children had been awake during the fight, suggesting they might have witnessed part of it. But when investigators spoke with the kids, they learned the children had been sound asleep from the moment they went to bed until officers woke them after the shooting. The idea of them witnessing anything was impossible. It seemed like Mark was throwing out scenarios, hoping one might stick. The more he spoke, the clearer it became that he was trying to shape the narrative in his favor. He emphasized how upset Samantha had been, painting her as unstable, while positioning himself as the calm husband caught off guard by her actions. Yet his composure cracked whenever detectives confronted him with evidence that contradicted his claims. The forensic results, the lack of defensive wounds, and the absence of any struggle in the bedroom all undermined his words. Investigators realized they weren't just dealing with a grieving husband. They were dealing with someone who was carefully crafting lies, a man who thought he could outsmart the truth, but was unraveling with every new detail. When investigators gained access to Samantha's phone, they discovered the messages that would shift the entire case. Hours before her death, Samantha had been texting a close friend, pouring out her fear and frustration. "I can't do this anymore. I'm leaving him," she wrote. Another message struck investigators like a warning from beyond the grave. "He said if I ever left, he'd ruin me." The tone of desperation in her words left little doubt that she was afraid of her husband. These texts dismantled the image of a sudden, heated argument and instead painted a picture of a woman trapped in a dangerous situation. Alongside the messages, detectives reviewed Samantha's internet history. She had been searching for apartments in nearby towns, places where she could move with her children and start over. She had also looked up legal advice for divorce proceedings, indicating she was serious about separating from Mark. To investigators, this confirmed what friends had already told them. Samantha was preparing to leave, and Mark must have known it. On the other side of the story, Mark's digital footprint revealed something darker. His laptop contained searches that made it impossible to ignore his potential intent. Queries like, "Can you track a spouse through phone records?" and "How long after death can life insurance be claimed?" suggested that he was not only aware of Samantha's plans, but also considering the consequences of her departure. These searches were chillingly precise, leaving investigators to wonder if Samantha's death had been carefully planned rather than the product of a sudden rage. The discovery of these texts and searches shifted the investigation from doubt to certainty. What began as a question of accident versus intent now pointed clearly toward premeditation. Mark was no longer just a suspect. He was the only logical culprit. As detectives pieced together Mark's motive, another shocking revelation came to light. Hidden among his phone records and messages was evidence of an affair with a younger woman he had met at the local gym. At first, the relationship appeared casual, but as investigators read through months of conversations, it became clear that Mark was emotionally invested. He sent her affectionate messages late at night, promised her a future, and spoke about how unhappy he was in his marriage. To her, it might have seemed like harmless flirting with a married man, but to investigators, it provided a devastating new motive. The affair had started months before Samantha's death, intensifying in the weeks leading up to it. Mark often complained about how his wife didn't understand him and how he felt trapped at home. He told his lover that he wished he could be free to start over, but divorce was never part of his language. For a man obsessed with control and reputation, divorce meant shame, financial ruin, and losing custody battles he might not win. Murder, however, meant freedom, a payout from Samantha's life insurance, and the possibility of starting fresh with someone new. The younger woman was questioned and insisted she had no idea about any violent intentions. She told investigators she believed Mark was simply venting about marital problems. Yet the timeline of their conversations told a more troubling story. Just days before Samantha's death, Mark assured her that things would be sorted out soon. To detectives, that phrase carried an ominous weight, suggesting that Samantha's death was not only anticipated but may have been part of a plan. The affair transformed the case. What looked like a desperate act during a fight was now seen as a calculated decision fueled by desire, greed, and betrayal. The crime scene told a story far different from the one Mark Keithley wanted people to believe. Forensic experts began reconstructing the shooting in detail, analyzing blood spatter, bullet trajectory, and the position of Samantha's body. What they found was devastating to his claim of a struggle. The trajectory of the bullet showed it had been fired from a distance of at least 3 feet, not during a close-quarters fight. Samantha had been sitting on the edge of the bed when the round struck her chest, meaning she had little or no time to react. This alone destroyed the idea that she had been holding the weapon. Blood spatter patterns were equally damning. The direction and spread revealed that Samantha had been stationary when shot, with no signs of sudden movement or impact. If she had been wrestling with Mark, the spray would have been more chaotic, showing signs of motion and struggle. Instead, the blood formed a clean pattern consistent with a victim caught off guard. The sheets beneath her carried stains that suggested she fell back almost instantly after the bullet entered her body. Investigators also noted the lack of disruption in the room. Nothing was overturned, nothing broken, nothing to suggest the violent confrontation Mark described. The dresser where he claimed the gun had been placed was dusted for prints. Only his were present, and none of Samantha's fingerprints were found on the weapon. This reconstruction painted a chilling picture. Samantha had not lunged for the gun in anger. She had been sitting quietly, likely unaware of the danger she was in, when her husband aimed and pulled the trigger. The evidence proved this was no accident. It was an execution carried out in the most intimate space of their home. The trial of Mark Keithley drew enormous attention, both locally and nationally. Courtrooms filled each day with reporters, community members, and even strangers fascinated by the shocking story of a deputy accused of murdering his wife. The prosecution presented their case with precision, walking the jury through every detail of the investigation. They highlighted the inconsistencies in Mark's story, the lack of evidence supporting a struggle, and the damning forensic findings that proved Samantha had been shot from a distance. The texts from Samantha and the internet searches from Mark's laptop became key pieces of evidence, laying bare a chilling combination of fear on one side and planning on the other. Jurors listened as friends and family testified about Samantha's growing unhappiness and her plans to leave. They heard how she confided that Mark threatened to ruin her if she walked away. Financial experts explained the couple's debts and how Mark stood to gain from her life insurance policies. The prosecution also revealed the affair, exposing his desire for freedom and a new relationship. Piece by piece, they constructed a narrative of motive, opportunity, and intent. The defense fought back hard, insisting the shooting was a tragic accident. They portrayed Mark as a man pushed to his limits by marital strife and argued that the state had no concrete evidence proving premeditation. They urged jurors to see him as a husband who made a mistake, not a cold-blooded killer. But the weight of the evidence proved impossible to ignore. After 2 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning with their decision. Mark Keithley was found guilty of first-degree murder. The verdict confirmed what investigators had long suspected, that Samantha's death was not an accident, but a deliberate act of betrayal. Mark Keithley's sentencing was the final chapter in a story that had stunned an entire community. The judge handed down life in prison without the possibility of parole, a punishment that reflected both the brutality of the crime and the betrayal of his oath as a law enforcement officer. For the courtroom, it was a moment of closure, but for Samantha's loved ones, the pain could never be erased. Her parents, who had sat through every day of testimony, wept as they thought of the 2 children left behind. They would grow up without their mother's warmth and without their father's presence, burdened by the knowledge of what he had done. The woman Mark had been having an affair with disappeared from the spotlight almost immediately. She never faced charges, but the revelation of her involvement in his life brought her intense scrutiny. She insisted she had no idea what Mark was planning, and investigators found no evidence linking her directly to the crime. Still, her role and his desire for freedom became part of the story, a reminder of the tangled motivations that led to Samantha's death. For the public, the case left haunting questions. Was this truly premeditated, with Mark calculating every step until he pulled the trigger? Or did he act in a sudden outburst of rage, driven by fear of losing control? The evidence pointed toward planning, but only Mark knows exactly what went through his mind in those final moments. In the years that followed, Samantha's family worked to preserve her memory, telling stories of her kindness and her devotion to her children. What began as the image of a perfect family was revealed as something far darker. Behind closed doors, love had been replaced by control, and control had ended in murder.